Hello everyone, it's Becky Goldsmith and I want to give you some foundation paper piecing tips that go with the Bullseye Quilts from vintage to modern in here. Now, inside the book there's a chart that tells you how many strips of what size to cut for each piece in each ring, right? They're all different. So I'm going to focus on ring number 1, and I've cut my pieces for number 1, which is the inside part of the ring, and then number 2, and then number 3. I've cut some shapes already. Be aware that not every ring is numbered 1, 2, 3 from the inside out. Sometimes they're numbered from the top down. You have to pay attention. All right, so I've cut my pieces and I've got my vellum foundation papers ready to go and cut out exactly as you see here. I don't like to leave extra paper around the edges. I find it's less accurate and harder to do. It's not that hard to just go ahead and cut these out. And here's a little trick. When you've made your copies, with the vellum, you can see through it and you can line up 2, 3, or 4 sheets, one on top of each other, and put lots of staples in it and cut them out multiples at a time. It does speed that process up. All right, so I've got a one paper for the first section of ring number 1. And I've got my number 1 fabric and my number 2 fabric. You always place your fabrics right sides together, and they always go underneath the paper. You need to look at how the fabrics work, how these shapes go together. So let me pull in here just a little bit. So number 1, I can put the paper over it and easily see that the number 1 fabric covers the entire space, including the seam allowance for the number 1 shape. Now, I want to position the fabrics right sides together, so that the number 2 shape, when I sew on the solid line, when that opens up, that number 2 shape will completely cover, including the far seam allowance, the number 2 section. And I've got one already sewn. So I would position my pieces like this, and I would sew. You always sew on the solid line. The dashed lines indicate the edges of the seam allowance. And I know some of you, when you do foundation paper piecing, you're kind of cavalier about that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I don't think that's a good idea. I think when the whole quilt is made, it works better if you've got accurate seam allowances all the way through. So let me pull this over. I have one already sewn. If you are in doubt before you put this in your machine to sew it, you can put a little pin here and fold the fabric open just to make sure that it covers the space. But I could see that it did, so I sewed with a shorter seam allowance than I would normally sew all the way through, all the way off the paper in either direction. And then I would press this open. The next thing to do is to trim away the excess fabric along that dashed seam allowance. So pretend like I'm on my cutting mat. There's 2 ways you can go about this. So here's my seam, my sewn seam. Here's the fabric. This is where I want that to be cut. I'm using a bookmark. You can use any other rigid piece of cardstock. Place it just this side of that dashed line, because when you fold the paper over it, that occupies some space. Now, I would use my rotary cutter and trim right there along the edge of the paper, doing my best not to trim the paper. If that makes you nervous, you could instead fold the paper here and use a ruler or one of those add a 1/4 rulers to add a 1/4 of an inch beyond the solid seam line. you can do it whichever way you want. I just don't like using the little rulers because I'm lazy. So I would trim this away and then position the next piece of fabric. So the next piece is a 2.5 inch square. I positioned it over the blue fabric so that when you open it up, it covers that whole area. And I've already sewn this one. Now, it's in the instructions, but I want to highlight it in this video. Anytime there's a little circle, sew to the circle and backstitch. Do not sew beyond that circle into the seam allowance. It will mess with your piecing later if you do. So at this point, I would press this open, place it on my cutting mat, and trim away the excess fabric. Now, let's get real. I would do all of the ones for this ring before I trim them down. But just to say, I would place this down. You can use a ruler and place it so that you are measuring 1/4 inch out from the seam line if you prefer. You can follow the dashed line, whatever makes you happy. But you do want to trim the shapes so that they look like this. If having this fabric out here, sometimes there's going to be shapes that kind of move away from the fabric a little bit. If you want to, oh, I got fuzz in my glue stick. If you want to put a little bit of glue there to hold that wobbly end in place, you certainly can do that on all of your shapes. Now, just a little bit of glue, not a lot. When it's time to sew these together, you may have already noticed there's a little bit of a Y seam. You always pin with the inner point on top. And before you even begin to think about a positioning pin, take a minute and tear the paper into the inner point there of the Y seam. Just tear the paper, because when you sew it, you're going to need that to open. And if you haven't torn the paper, you can't make it do that. So I would tear the little paper and I would use a positioning pin right through that seam. I double check it on the front and match it to the corresponding part on the outer point. Line that up on the positioning pin, swing it around, and you should see that nice valley that's formed there right at the 1/4 inch seam allowance? That's what you want to see. If you want to, you can throw in a pin just to hold everything straight. Now, this is where you have choices in your sewing. You can sew to that point and backstitch. Take it out of the machine, match it up, and put your needle back in, do a little back stitching, and sew off the end. Or you can sew to this point, drop your needle, and pivot that around and sew. What I found is that some of the Y seams are more inset than others. So I had some shapes that worked better if I sewed to their backstitch and took them out, and others I could do it the easy way in the machine, faster and easier. Now, when you do this, here's one that's already sewn. Whether you sew to here and take it out or not, the movement that you make to bring these together is the same. And what I mean by that is you're going to swing this around and this is going to bubble up, right? You want to make sure that as you swing this shape around to match the edges of the seam allowance, that you don't pull it, because if you pull it, it'll be too long. You want to sort of push it a little bit so that you don't stretch the inner point out of position. And I like to get my finger in here and hold that up. And once I get it lined up, go ahead and flatten that and crease it. And once you get it there, line it up, you'll see it makes that nice little indented valley at the far end as well. You can throw in a pin, you can use a one of those flat clips. You know the ones, I mean the binder clips, the ones that Clover makes. The little ones, bigger ones, those are handy to use here. You could also use a clip up here to help hold that in place. In fact, just a second, I'll grab a clip. Here I am. Whoops, sorry, that went way out of focus. One of these, one of those, they're handy. So you could do that and just sew it on down. Once you get those sewn, here I've got two sewn together, you always, 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 and this is in the instructions, you always remove the paper from the seam allowance before you press. That helps keep the shapes flatter. It doesn't stretch them out of shape, and it also makes the paper easier to remove later once you've got the ring, once you're putting the ring together. Now I keep going back to the instructions, but I can't help myself. What the instructions tell you to do is sew two of these pieces together and then two more and two more and two more till you've got all your twos together. Then you sew them together into fours and then eights and then 16s and then sometimes 32s and then the bigger rings. Sometimes, are there 64? I can't remember. Maybe so. If there are, you sew that many together until you eventually have the whole ring put together. So that is how you do the bulk of the piecing. None of this is hard, not even one little bit. You always sew with the paper right side up facing you. You always sew on the solid line. The dashed line always indicates the raw edge of the seam allowance. And these arrows, which I didn't mention a minute ago, always tell you what direction to press the seam allowances. Always press the seam allowances to one side. Do not press them open. I think that covers the basics. I hope you enjoy this and make lots and lots and lots of bullseye quilts. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have many happy stitches.